Its mother is gone. A German Shepherd puppy sits in the middle of the road, silently in the freezing snow. Its entire body is covered in a layer of icy cold ice. On that road, a K-9 Navy SEAL braves the storm, not expecting anything, just trying to forget the pain of the past, the loss of his companion. The moment he encounters it, something within him awakens. Sometimes a small figure can save a broken heart. Before we begin, please let me know where you're watching from. Subscribe for more. Snow had been falling for nearly 48 hours, erasing the mountains inch by inch, turning the forest into a vast white silence where sound died before it could travel. Ethan Walker drove alone through that silence, his pickup truck crawling along what used to be a logging road, now little more than a pale scar carved between walls of pine and ice. The sky pressed low and heavy, the kind of winter ceiling that made a man feel smaller than his own thoughts. At 39, Ethan carried himself with the rigid economy of someone trained never to waste movement. Broad-shouldered and tall, his frame still held the quiet power of a soldier, though it was softened now by isolation rather than command. His dark hair was cut short out of habit, streaked faintly with gray at the temples, not from age but from years that had demanded more than they ever returned. A rough shadow of beard lined his jaw, the kind grown not for style but because mirrors no longer mattered. The road curved sharply ahead, snow drifting across it in uneven waves. Ethan's gloved hands tightened on the steering wheel as the truck slid slightly, tires searching for grip. He corrected without panic, muscle memory guiding him. Panic was a luxury he'd learned to abandon long ago. He wasn't driving toward anything in particular. He was driving because movement kept the noise down, because staying still gave his memories time to speak. Years earlier, he had been a Navy SEALK 9 handler, the kind assigned to missions where silence mattered more than speed. He had learned to trust instinct sharpened by survival, to read danger in a dog's posture, to breathe slowly even when the world burned. That life was gone now, left behind in heat and dust, in a place where the sky was too wide and the nights never truly cooled. What remained was the weight of it, carried quietly, pressed deep behind gray-blue eyes that rarely lingered on the past but never escaped it. The truck lurched. Ethan slammed the brakes, the vehicle skidding sideways before grinding to a halt. His heart jumped, sharp and immediate, before settling back into its controlled rhythm. He leaned forward, peering through the windshield as snow hissed against the glass. At first he saw nothing but white. Then the shape resolved itself, dark and impossibly small against the road. A puppy. It stood in the center of the road, legs trembling, fur matted with snow. A German Shepherd, no more than 6 weeks old, its body too thin, its movements sluggish. One ear drooped awkwardly, the other barely trying to stand, as if even the effort of listening was too much. Its coat, black and tan beneath the frost, looked dull and stiff with cold, and its breath came in short, visible puffs that barely disturbed the air. Ethan muttered under his breath, anger slipping through the cracks of his composure. He scanned the road, the tree line, the slope beyond. No footprints, no tire tracks leading away. No sign of another vehicle. The puppy hadn't wandered here. It had been left. He stayed seated for a moment, staring through the windshield, jaw tight. This was the moment he knew too well. The pause before a choice. He could drive around it, tell himself there was nothing he could do, that winter claimed things without asking permission. He had told himself things like that before, in places far from snow. He exhaled slowly, the breath fogging the cab. Not today, he said quietly, though he wasn't sure who he was speaking to. The door opened anyway. The cold hit him like a physical blow, slicing through layers of fabric and memory alike. Snow crunched under his boots as he stepped toward the puppy, every movement deliberate, controlled. The puppy tried to back away, then stopped, legs giving out as it sank into the snow with a weak whimper. Its eyes lifted to him, dark and unfocused, not afraid so much as exhausted. Ethan crouched a few feet away, ignoring the way the cold seeped through his knees. He pulled off one glove, then the other, exposing his hands to the brutal air. They were scarred hands, knuckles thickened by years of impact and strain, fingers steady even now. He extended one slowly, palm down, keeping his posture low and non-threatening. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough but gentle, the same tone he had once used with frightened civilians and injured dogs alike. "I'm not here to hurt you." The puppy trembled violently, trying to lift a paw, failing. Its small body sagged, sides heaving too fast, too shallow. Ethan recognized the signs immediately. Hypothermia, severe, the kind that didn't leave room for hesitation. He moved forward then, closing the distance in 2 careful steps, scooping the puppy up against his chest and tucking it inside his jacket. The animal was shockingly light, ribs sharp beneath the fur, its heartbeat faint but present. Ethan pressed his forearm protectively around the small body, turning slightly to block the wind as he headed back to the truck. Inside the cab, he cranked the heater, stripping off his outer jacket and wrapping it around the puppy to trap warmth. The puppy shuddered once, then stilled, its head pressing weakly against his chest. Ethan's throat tightened unexpectedly. He looked down, forcing himself to stay focused, to treat this like a mission, not a memory. "Stay with me," he murmured. "Just stay." The engine idled as he pulled back onto the road, driving slower now, every sense alert. The cabin was still miles away, a rough structure tucked deep in the forest where he'd been hiding out since early winter. He had chosen it because no one else wanted it, because isolation felt safer than expectation. Now it felt like the only place that mattered. As the truck crawled forward, Ethan glanced down at the small shape bundled against him. The puppy's breathing was still shallow, but steadier, its body absorbing what little warmth he could give. Something shifted inside him, subtle but undeniable, like a door he'd sealed long ago, cracking open under pressure. He hadn't planned to stop. He hadn't planned to care. But the road had forced his hand, just as it had all those years ago when he'd learned that walking away didn't always mean surviving. Outside, the storm pressed on, relentless and indifferent. Inside the truck, a man who had spent years outrunning his past realized with quiet certainty that this was one road he would never be allowed to pass again. The cabin emerged from the trees like a memory half buried, its rough timber walls bowed under the weight of snow, a single narrow porch sagging as if exhausted by the long winter. Ethan cut the engine and sat still for a breath, listening to the ticking metal cool and the wind worrying the eaves, aware that the smallest life pressed inside his jacket depended entirely on what he did next. He moved with trained urgency the moment the door opened, boots crunching hard across the porch, shoulder bracing the warped frame as he pushed inside. The cabin smelled of pine resin, old smoke, and solitude. It was small one main room, a narrow sleeping alcove, a battered table scarred by years of use. But it was shelter. Ethan kicked the door shut behind him, dropped his pack, and crossed straight to the iron stove in the corner, hands already shaking from the cold he'd ignored too long. The puppy barely stirred as he unwrapped it, its small body limp in a way that set every alarm bell ringing in Ethan's head. Up close, the dog looked even younger than he'd thought, ribs faintly visible beneath the thin black and tan coat, paws oversized in that unmistakable way that promised growth if it survived. Its eyes fluttered open once, unfocused, then slid shut again. The breath came shallow, irregular. Ethan felt for a heartbeat with 2 fingers, counting silently, jaw clenched. Still there, weak but there. He built the fire fast, not caring how much wood he burned. The stove began to radiate a dull, honest heat, and Ethan laid the puppy on a folded wool blanket a safe distance away, careful not to shock its system. He stripped off his jacket, then his outer shirt, wrapping both around the small body, adding his own warmth with practiced restraint. This wasn't comfort. It was protocol. Gradual heat. Slow breathing. Stay present. Ethan knelt on the floor, back straight despite the ache settling into his bones. His face, lined by cold and years of controlled violence, remained calm, but inside his chest something battered hard against its cage. He'd lost dogs before, lost men, lost moments he could never walk back. He refused to let his mind go there now. The puppy needed his hands steady, his thoughts sharp. Minutes passed, then more. The puppy shuddered, a violent tremor running through its small frame, then went still again. Ethan leaned closer, lowering his head until his breath warmed the fur at its neck. "Stay?" he murmured, the word less an order than a plea. His voice sounded strange to his own ears, roughened by disuse, softened by fear. He didn't bother to deny. He warmed milk on the stove, watching it carefully, testing it against his wrist the way he'd once been taught. When he brought the bowl close, the puppy didn't respond. Its mouth remained slack, tongue barely visible. Ethan didn't force it. He knew better. He dipped a finger, touched a single drop to the pup's lips. Nothing. He sat back on his heels, exhaling through his nose, patience hard-earned but intact. Night settled fully outside, the storm deepening, snow rattling against the small window like thrown gravel. The generator coughed once, then steadied, its low hum the only sound besides the fire. Ethan stayed on the floor, unmoving except for the occasional adjustment of the blanket, the careful monitoring of breath and pulse. Time stretched into something elastic, each second heavy with consequence. At some point, exhaustion tried to claim him, dragging at his shoulders, whispering that he'd done all he could. Ethan shook it off. He had learned in other winters, in other kinds of dark, that survival often came down to who stayed awake longer. He pressed 2 fingers to the puppy's chest again and felt a faint but steady rhythm. Still fighting. Good. Near dawn, when the sky outside lightened from black to a dull iron gray, the puppy stirred. Just a little. Its nose twitched. Its mouth opened, closed. Ethan leaned forward instantly, heart hammering now despite himself. He dipped his finger in the milk again and touched it gently to the pup's tongue. This time, there was a response. Weak, almost nothing. But there. "That's it?" Ethan said quietly, a rare smile tugging at one corner of his mouth before he shut it down. "Easy?" The puppy swallowed once, then again. It wasn't feeding, not really, but it was choosing to stay. Ethan let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding and sat back, every muscle trembling with delayed reaction. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. But the night hadn't taken the win. Morning brought no comfort, only clarity. The storm eased slightly, leaving behind a world locked in white silence. Ethan stood, stretching slowly, joints protesting. He moved with care now, fatigue making his edges duller. He checked the puppy again, noted the marginal improvement, and began planning the next steps with the same methodical precision he'd once used before missions. He stepped outside briefly to clear snow from the door, scanning the tree line out of habit. No movement, no tracks. Isolation complete. When he returned, the puppy opened one eye, dark and glassy, but aware enough to follow him weakly. Ethan paused, struck unexpectedly by the simple fact of it. Being seen. The day passed in careful cycles, warmth, monitoring, tiny sips of milk that often went untouched. The puppy's breathing remained shallow, but more regular. Ethan allowed himself food only when his hands began to shake too badly to trust. He ate standing up, never far from the blanket on the floor. As evening fell, exhaustion dragged him down again, heavier now. He sat against the wall, legs stretched out, eyes on the small rise and fall of the puppy's chest. In the quiet, memories crept closer, uninvited. Another night, another small body, another decision that had ended differently. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, jaw tightening, then opened them again. "Not this time," he said aloud, the words grounding him. He reached out, resting 2 fingers lightly against the puppy's side. The warmth was there now, faint but real. Outside, the wind moaned through the pines, indifferent to hope or effort. Inside the cabin, a man who had once trusted only discipline and distance stayed exactly where he was, understanding with brutal clarity that survival was never about luck. It was about presence, about staying when it hurt, about refusing to leave. When the puppy finally slept, not unconscious, but real sleep, breath deepening just enough to ease the tight knot in Ethan's chest, he allowed himself to lean his head back against the wall. His eyes burned, his body ached, but for the first time in years, the ache felt earned. The fight wasn't over. He knew that. Dawn would bring new risks, new decisions. But as the fire crackled softly and the storm loosened its grip outside, Ethan understood something else just as clearly. This wasn't a detour. This was the path. And he was no longer walking it alone. The storm returned with renewed fury, wind slamming into the cabin walls as if testing their resolve. Snow piling against the windows until the world beyond disappeared entirely. Ethan woke to the generator sputtering, its rhythm uneven, the low hum that had steadied him all night breaking into coughs of mechanical protest. He was on the floor beside the stove, back against the wall, legs stiff, neck aching. For a single disoriented second, he didn't remember where he was. Then he felt the fragile warmth beneath his hand, and everything snapped into focus. The puppy lay curled in the blanket near the stove, small body rising and falling too fast, too shallow. Its fur was no longer icy, but it wasn't warm either, only hovering in a narrow margin between danger and hope. Ethan pressed 2 fingers gently against its chest, counting again. Still there, still fighting, but weaker than before. The generator coughed again, lights flickering once, twice. Ethan stood quickly, despite the protest in his joints, crossed the room, and steadied the machine with practiced hands. He had fixed worse equipment under worse conditions. He adjusted the choke, listened, waited. When the engine finally settled into a strained but steady rhythm, he exhaled through his teeth, relief sharp and brief. He didn't trust relief. He returned to the puppy and shrugged out of his sweater, folding it around the small body beneath the blanket. He sat back down, legs drawn in close, posture instinctively protective. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, a sound that reminded him too much of rotor wash, of nights when the sky itself seemed angry. He closed his eyes for half a second, then opened them again. Sleep was not an option. Not tonight. The puppy stirred faintly, letting out a weak sound that barely qualified as a whimper. Its head lifted a fraction, then dropped back down. Ethan leaned closer, lowering his face until his breath brushed the fur at its neck. He slowed his breathing deliberately, deep and controlled, the way he had learned to calm dogs trained for chaos. "You're here," he said quietly. "I've got you." He didn't know why he said it. Maybe the words were for himself. Time lost its shape as the night stretched on. Ethan moved in small, careful motions, adjusting the blanket, checking the fire, monitoring the puppy's breathing. Every decision was measured. No rushing warmth, no forcing food. Discipline over desperation. That lesson had been written into him long before snow and cabins and lost roads. At some point the puppy began to shiver again, violent tremors racking its thin frame. Ethan reacted instantly, pulling it closer, pressing it gently against his chest beneath the blanket, adding his own body heat with controlled pressure. His arms tightened reflexively, muscle memory rising unbidden. He had carried injured men like this once, held pressure where blood tried to escape. The memory bit hard, sharp enough to steal his breath. "Stay," he whispered again, the word grounding him. "Just stay." The shivering eased gradually, replaced by a fragile stillness that frightened him even more. Ethan listened intently, ear close to the puppy's chest, counting every shallow breath. Outside, the storm roared louder, as if competing for the small life in his arms. He refused to acknowledge it. Near the darkest point of night, when even the fire seemed to burn lower, Ethan warmed the milk again. He tested it carefully, then brought it close, not expecting success. The puppy's mouth opened weakly, tongue barely moving. Ethan dipped his finger and touched a drop to its lips. Nothing. He waited, tried again. This time there was the faintest response. The puppy swallowed once, reflex more than choice. Ethan froze, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. He waited, heart pounding, then tried again. Another swallow. Tiny, fragile, real. "That's it," he murmured, voice hoarse now. "That's enough." He didn't push further. He knew better. Survival was built on patience, not victories. He set the bowl aside and returned the puppy to the blanket, keeping his hand against its side, feeling the uneven but persistent rhythm beneath his fingers. The hours crept toward morning. The storm outside began to shift, wind losing some of its edge, snowfall lightening from violence to persistence. The puppy slept, not unconscious, not drifting, but a shallow, fragile sleep that came with effort. Ethan didn't let himself relax. He watched the rise and fall of its chest, counting breaths, marking time. As the first weak light filtered through the snow-choked window, Ethan felt something inside him crack open, slow and painful. Exhaustion pressed down hard now, dragging at his shoulders, pulling memories closer. Another night, years ago, when he had counted breaths just like this. Another small body. Another dawn that had come too late. He swallowed, jaw tightening, and forced himself back into the present. This night wasn't that night. This time he was still here. The puppy stirred again as dawn fully claimed the sky, lifting its head a fraction, eyes barely open, but aware enough to find him. Ethan met that unfocused gaze and felt an unexpected weight settle in his chest. Not fear, responsibility. "You made it through," he said quietly. just the first part. The puppy's tail twitched once, a movement so small it could have been imagined. Ethan huffed out a breath that might have been a laugh, or might have been a release he hadn't known how to name. He stood slowly, stretching stiff muscles, and added wood to the stove. The cabin remained cold, but it was no longer hostile. The generator held. The fire burned steady. The storm retreated inch by inch, leaving behind a silence that felt earned. Ethan knelt beside the puppy again, checking its temperature, noting the gradual improvement. It wasn't safe. Not yet. But it was alive, and that mattered. He sat back against the wall, letting his head rest there for a moment, eyes open, alert, but softer than before. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the urge to leave as soon as the danger passed. He didn't think about the road or what waited beyond the trees. Everything that mattered was right here on the floor beside him, wrapped in blankets and stubborn breath. Outside, morning crept across the frozen forest, pale and cautious. Inside the cabin, a man who had learned to survive by walking away stayed exactly where he was, understanding with quiet certainty that some nights were not meant to be escaped. They were meant to be endured, and this one, against all odds, had been. The storm loosened its grip some time after dawn, not ending so much as retreating, leaving behind a forest stunned into silence and a sky the color of dull steel. Ethan noticed the quiet first. The absence of wind felt almost louder than the howling that had filled the night. He stood at the cabin window, one hand resting against the cold glass, eyes scanning the white expanse between the trees. No fresh snowfall, no movement, just the long, aching stillness that followed survival. Behind him, the puppy lay wrapped in layered blankets near the stove. Its breathing was steadier now, still shallow but no longer frantic, each rise and fall a small negotiation with life. Ethan knelt beside it, checking its gums, its paws, its temperature by touch rather than guesswork. Not out of danger, but no longer slipping away. That mattered. 2 days passed like this, measured not by hours, but by routines. Warmth, monitoring, tiny sips of milk that sometimes stayed down and sometimes didn't. The puppy slept more than it woke, but when its eyes opened, they tracked Ethan with a faint, curious awareness. It wasn't trust yet. It was recognition. On the second morning, the sound of footsteps reached the cabin. Ethan froze instantly, every muscle tightening, his body reacting before his mind caught up. He moved to the door without thinking, one hand hovering near the old knife at his belt, eyes narrowing as he listened. The steps were careful, deliberate, not the careless crunch of someone lost, someone who knew snow, someone who expected to be seen. A knock followed, not loud, not urgent. 3 steady taps. Ethan opened the door slowly. The woman standing on the porch looked like she belonged to the winter. She was in her mid-30s, tall and lean, her posture straight but not rigid. A thick forest green parka was zipped to her chin, dusted with snow along the shoulders. A knitted hat held back a cascade of chestnut brown hair that escaped in loose strands, catching the light. Her skin was pale from the cold, lightly freckled across the bridge of her nose, cheeks flushed from the climb. Her eyes, clear gray with a hint of blue, were alert but calm, the kind that took in details without judgment. "Good morning," she said, voice steady, not startled by the sight of him. "I'm Sarah Mitchell, County Animal Rescue." Ethan didn't respond immediately. He took her in the way he'd once assessed unfamiliar terrain, quickly, thoroughly. No visible weapon. Hands relaxed at her sides. A canvas medical bag slung over one shoulder, worn but well cared for. Her boots were practical, well broken in. She wasn't here by accident. "I follow up after storms," she continued, nodding toward the trees. "The Forestry Service keeps a list of old cabins. Yours was flagged as occupied. I check for people and animals that might be trapped." Her gaze shifted past him, just briefly, toward the stove. She didn't step forward. She didn't assume. She waited. "There's a puppy," Ethan said finally, his voice rough from disuse. "He was abandoned, hypothermic." Something softened in her expression, not pity, but recognition. "May I come in?" she asked. Ethan hesitated. Old habits flared, privacy, distance, the instinct to keep the world out. Then the puppy stirred behind him, letting out a faint sound, and the choice resolved itself. "Yeah," he said, stepping aside. "Careful. Floor's uneven." Inside, Sarah moved with quiet respect, setting her bag down slowly, kneeling near the stove without crossing any invisible lines. She studied the puppy from a distance first, eyes sharp now, professional. When she finally reached out, it was gentle, practiced, her touch light as she checked ears, paws, breathing. "He's young," she said softly. 6 weeks, maybe less. Shepherd mix by the look of him. "You did the right thing bringing him in. Most people would have panicked." "I don't panic," Ethan replied. A corner of her mouth twitched. "I can see that." She worked efficiently, pulling supplies from her bag saline, a small thermometer, medication measured carefully. She explained what she was doing as she went, not condescending, not rushed. Her voice carried the patience of someone used to fear, used to sitting with it until it settled. "He's stabilizing," she said after a while. "Still fragile? 2 days ago, this could have gone very differently." Ethan nodded once. He already knew. They fell into a rhythm over the next 2 days. Sarah returned each morning, snow permitting, bringing supplies, helping with feeding schedules, showing Ethan techniques that complemented his instincts rather than contradicting them. She noticed the way he listened, the way he adjusted immediately without ego. Not a man who needed to be right. A man who needed the outcome. In quieter moments, she observed him too. The old scars on his hands, the way he positioned himself instinctively between the puppy and the door, the way he never raised his voice. "You military?" she asked once, casually, as she cleaned a syringe. "Was," Ethan said. SEALK9. That explained things. The discipline, the patience, the ghosts he didn't name. On the 3rd evening, the puppy surprised them both. Ethan was kneeling beside the blankets, preparing another small feeding, when the puppy lifted its head higher than before. Its legs trembled, but it held itself up, eyes focused, ears twitching as if listening to something only it could hear. Then it barked. The sound was weak, cracked by exhaustion, but it was unmistakably deliberate. A single, defiant note that filled the small cabin and then faded. Ethan froze. Sarah smiled, slow and genuine. "Well," she said, "that's new." Ethan stared at the puppy, something tightening in his chest. He hadn't realized he'd been avoiding the question until it answered itself. "You need a name," he said quietly. The puppy barked again, softer this time, tail giving the faintest wag. Ethan exhaled. "Buddy," he said. The word felt strange on his tongue. "Familiar?" "Yeah, Buddy." The puppy settled back down, as if satisfied. From that moment, the line shifted. This was no longer temporary care, no longer just survival. Ethan felt it settle into him, heavy and certain, like an order he wouldn't question. Sarah packed up her bag later that night, standing by the door as the sky darkened again. He's going to need follow-up, she said. Vaccines, food, time. Ethan met her gaze. He'll get it. She nodded, studying him for a second longer than necessary. You're good with him, she said. Not everyone who's been through what you've been through can stay. Ethan didn't answer. He didn't need to. After she left, the cabin felt different. Not crowded, just inhabited. Ethan sat beside Buddy, resting a hand against the small, warm body, feeling the steady breath beneath his palm. Outside, the forest waited. Inside, something had already changed. Spring did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments, thin streams of water slipping from the cabin's eaves, patches of dark earth emerging beneath retreating snow, the faint scent of pine and thaw carried on colder mornings that no longer cut quite as deep. Ethan noticed the changes the way he noticed everything else now, quietly, attentively, without rushing to name them. Weeks had passed since the storm, marked not by calendars, but by Buddy's steady transformation. The puppy that had once fit inside his jacket now sprawled across the cabin floor, all legs and curiosity, black and tan coat thickening, ears finally deciding to stand on their own. He was still young, still clumsy, but the weakness had left him. What remained was energy, intelligence, and a sharp, watchful gaze that missed very little. Every morning began the same way. Ethan rose before the sun, brewed coffee over the stove, and stepped outside with Buddy trotting at his heels. The forest greeted them with a softer silence now, birds testing their voices, branches shedding snow with muted thumps. Buddy sniffed everything, nose low, tail wagging with restrained enthusiasm, absorbing the world as if memorizing it. Ethan let him explore, correcting gently, never sharply. This was not training for war. This was training for life. He set routines with the same discipline he once applied to missions. Sit, stay, come. Not barked commands, but calm expectations. Buddy learned quickly, responding not to force but to consistency. His eyes followed Ethan constantly, bright and focused, eager for approval, but never anxious. There was confidence there earned, not demanded. Sarah continued to visit, though less frequently now. When she arrived, Buddy greeted her with awkward joy, paws too big for his coordination, tail thumping against the cabin walls. She laughed easily, crouching to let him lick her gloves, her chestnut hair escaping its braid, more often now that winter no longer demanded containment. Without the heavy parka, she seemed lighter, taller somehow, her movements relaxed but purposeful. He's doing well, she said one afternoon, watching Ethan guide Buddy through a short recall exercise. Really well. Ethan nodded, offering no argument. He didn't boast. He didn't minimize it either. He simply accepted the truth of the moment. You ever think about formal training? Sarah asked, not pressing, just curious. Not military. Search and rescue. Therapy work? He's got the temperament. Ethan considered it, watching Buddy settle into a sit beside him without being asked. Maybe, he said. Not yet? Sarah smiled, understanding more than he'd said. She had learned his silences by now, learned where not to push. The cabin changed with the season. Windows opened. Tools came out. Ethan repaired loose boards, reinforced the porch, cleared a small yard where Buddy could run without disappearing into the trees. The work grounded him, muscles remembering honest labor that had nothing to do with survival and everything to do with building. Buddy supervised it all, trotting between tasks, occasionally stealing gloves or chewing sticks with solemn dedication. One evening, as the sun dipped lower than it had in months, painting the forest in amber light, Ethan sat on the porch steps with Buddy pressed against his leg. The dog's head rested on his knee, weight solid and warm. Ethan absent-mindedly ran his fingers through the thick fur, feeling the steady rise and fall of a body that no longer trembled. He realized then that he hadn't thought about leaving in weeks. The road beyond the trees no longer called to him. The need to keep moving, to outrun memories, had quieted. They were still there. Faces, nights, losses, but they no longer demanded escape. They existed alongside something new, something present. Buddy shifted, lifting his head to look up at him, eyes alert. A sound carried faintly through the trees, an engine, distant but approaching. Buddy's ears pricked, posture changing instantly, body angling forward with controlled interest. Ethan watched the response with a measured nod. Good awareness, no panic. The vehicle never came closer. It turned away somewhere down the mountain, the sound fading. Buddy relaxed, leaning back against Ethan with a satisfied huff. "That's enough," Ethan murmured, resting his chin briefly on the dog's head. "You did fine." Night fell gently now. No storms, no threats, just the slow rotation of days that no longer felt empty. Weeks later, the last of the snow vanished from the clearing, revealing grass flattened but alive beneath. Buddy discovered it first, tearing across the yard in wild, joyful loops, barking for the sheer pleasure of sound. Ethan laughed a short, surprised sound that caught in his throat before settling into something real. Buddy skidded to a stop, spun, and bounded back, skidding into Ethan's legs with unrestrained enthusiasm. "All right," Ethan said, steadying himself, smiling despite himself. "All right." Sarah visited that afternoon, bringing supplies and news from town small things, ordinary things. She noticed the laughter immediately, didn't comment on it, just filed it away with a quiet satisfaction. Before leaving, she paused at the bottom of the steps, looking back at Ethan and Buddy framed in warm light. "You've built something good here," she said. "Not just for him." Ethan met her gaze, then looked down at Buddy, who had settled into a calm sit, eyes tracking Sarah with friendly interest. "Yeah," he said softly, "I think I have." When Sarah drove away, Ethan didn't feel the old pull of isolation snap back into place. The cabin didn't close in. It breathed. Spring advanced steadily, green claiming ground inch by inch. Birds nested. Water ran freely through the ravines. Buddy grew stronger, his movements surer, his instincts sharpening into something purposeful but gentle. Ethan continued training not drills, not commands born of urgency, but exercises rooted in trust. Search games, scent work, long walks that ended with shared silence rather than exhaustion. One morning, standing at the edge of the clearing, Ethan watched Buddy navigate a simple tracking path he'd laid the day before. The dog followed it methodically, nose low, tail level, moving with focus that stirred something deep in Ethan's chest. Not pride exactly, recognition. "You're built for this," he said quietly when Buddy returned, sitting smartly at his feet, eyes bright. "Just like me." The thought didn't sting the way it once would have. As spring settled fully into the mountains, Ethan realized something else had changed. He wasn't waiting anymore, not for orders, not for permission, not for the past to loosen its grip. He had chosen to stay, and in staying, he had found something he hadn't known how to look for. Home. On a clear morning thick with birdsong, Ethan and Buddy stood together on the porch, watching mist lift from the trees. The air was cool but kind, the world open in a way it hadn't been before. Buddy leaned against him, solid and present. Neither of them was alone now. Winter had ended, not with a dramatic thaw, not with a declaration, but with a quiet understanding carried forward into every step they took together. And that was enough. Sometimes the moments that change us don't arrive with noise or certainty. They arrive quietly, on a forgotten road, in the form of a fragile life that forces us to stop when all we want is to keep moving. Ethan didn't set out to save anyone, yet by choosing to stay, to endure the cold instead of running from it, he learned a truth many of us forget. Helping another life can slowly return us to our own. In everyday life, we all face winters of our own loss, exhaustion, loneliness, moments when it feels easier to look away than to care. This story reminds us that healing rarely comes from escaping those moments, but from meeting them with patience, responsibility, and compassion. Even the smallest act of kindness, done consistently, can grow into something strong enough to change a future. If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from or what moment in this story spoke to you the most. And if you believe in second chances, quiet strength, and the bond that can heal both humans and animals, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Stay with us. There are more stories waiting, and every one of them begins with choosing not to walk away.